Morning, everybody. Thomas here, back with another video, and today I'm doing something a little different. Much like the style of Tougie24 and the Hockey Guy, both on YouTube. Make sure you go follow them. Really knowledgeable hockey people. And today we're going to try something a little different in a similar style to what they do. We're going to look over the trade history of general managers during their time with certain teams. And today, as you can tell by the title of the video and from the bottom right-hand corner, is Brian Burke's trade history during his time with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Personal feelings aside, was Brian Burke a good GM? That is up for debate. And I've seen the trade history beforehand, and yeah, there's some pretty good trades that he made, and then there's some that are not so great. We'll get into all of that. Let's get to the very first trade he made during his tenure with the Leafs. That was in January 7th of 2009, when Toronto acquired Brad May from Anaheim in exchange for a 2010 conditional 6th-round pick, which was never exercised. Brad May, of course, only spent one season with the Leafs, only playing 38 games because, of course, he was traded from Anaheim. So realistically, the Leafs got Brad May for nothing. This is a very minor win. In my honest opinion, you can count this as a draw or, a complete wash. But, I mean, the Leafs got a tad bit of use out of Brad May, basically in exchange for nothing. I should mention, of course, the wins and losses are self-explanatory. The draws are going to be trades that are either wash deals or just cancel each other out. That's how the draw system is going to work. Next trade, Toronto acquires Ryan Hamilton from Minnesota in exchange for Robbie Earl. Going through Ryan Hamilton's stats, he did not play with the Leafs very often, was in fact flipped between the minors. And when you look at Robbie Earl, was the same story with him in Minnesota. We are going to call this a wash. Honestly, it's not a loss, a wash. There we go. It's really a nothing deal. You're basically trading a minor leaguer for another minor leaguer, so it really doesn't affect or help either team. Moving on to the next page, there's really only about 2.5 pages. Realistically, not even a half. It's mostly 2 pages, and there's going to be some interesting trades coming up. Our first interesting one of 3 trades that was made on March 4th. Toronto acquired a 2nd-round pick that became Jesse Blacker in exchange for Dominic Moore. If you think about Blacker and his time with the Leafs, he wasn't there for very long. And that's what, Elite Prospects is going to tell us. He wasn't with the Leafs, period. He spent the majority of his career in the minors. So, realistically, Blacker never panned out. Dominic Moore, on the other hand, had a pretty decent NHL career. Obviously didn't put up really high numbers. Best season on paper is with Toronto in 2008-2009, and of course gets traded to Buffalo and bounces between every team. Just based off the fact that Blacker never panned out and Moore continued his career, and then of course Moore would actually come back to the Leafs. I'm going to count this as a loss for considering at the time of the trade of how Moore was performing and how Blacker just never, ever panned out. The second trade that was made on March 4th, Toronto would acquire a 2009 2nd-round pick that became Kenny Ryan and a 2010 conditional 4th-round pick, which is not specified, in exchange for Nick Antropov to the Rangers. Kenny Ryan was a guy who spent most of his career in the minors. Don't have to look up his stats. Nick Antropov, though, is an interesting name. He was with the Leafs for the majority of his career since 1999, and then, of course, got flipped to the Rangers about 10 years down the road. And, of course, penalty trouble he did run into at times. He was still a fan favorite, though, and, of course, was part of, Atlanta, and then the expansion, the relocation to Winnipeg at the time, and then, of course, decided to retire. And, looking through again, put up good numbers with Toronto, only played 18 games with New York. I'm gonna say this is kind of a draw in my eyes, because New York never really got much use out of him. You could call it a loss if you really want to, because Antropov continued his NHL career, but he didn't do it with the Rangers. He was only there for 18 games. It's really a nothing. It's really a nothing deal. And again, these picks, whether Kenny Ryan, would have produced or not, if he did, maybe it would be a win for Toronto. But it was Kenny Ryan and a conditional pick that was never specified. And then the last trade that was made on this day, Toronto acquires Jamie Heward, Olaf Kolzig, Andy Rogers, and a 2009 fourth-round pick from Tampa in exchange for Richard Pettiot. Jamie Heward used to play for the Leafs back in the mid-1990s. Didn't play a single game with the Leafs at the time of the trade. Olaf Kolzig never played a single game for the Leafs, and he would finish his career with the Tampa Bay Lightning, so never played a single game for the Leafs. Andy Rogers never played a single game for the Leafs. So the Leafs didn't get use out of any of these guys, at least not in the current day. And then, of course, you get to Richard Pettiot, 11 games in Tampa, and then was bounced around most other places. Really, this trade means nothing. This trade honestly means nothing. At least in my eyes, it means nothing. You could say maybe this is somewhat of a, if you go based off of names, if Toronto were to get Olaf Kolzig just based off names, then it'd be a win any day. But considering Heward, Kolzig, and Rogers never played a single game for the Leafs, at least in this era of Toronto, and Pettiot, was only utilized for 11 games, and that was it for Tampa, this is a nothing deal, honestly. March 10th, 2009, Toronto would acquire Jay Rosehill from Tampa Bay in exchange for future considerations. So basically, Toronto got Jay Rosehill for nothing. This is a very minor win, mind you, but still, you get a guy like Jay Rosehill for pretty much nothing. Yes, penalties are a humongous problem, obviously, for a guy like Jay Rosehill, but it's still nice to have a little bit of grit and get somebody like that for virtually nothing. Moving on to the next one, on Canada Day of 2009, Toronto would acquire Garnet Exelby and Colin Stewart from Atlanta in exchange for Pavel Kabina and Tim Stapleton. Garnet Exelby would play 51 games for the Leafs, picking up 73 penalty minutes, and that was it for him. That was it. Colin Stewart never played a single game for Toronto. Pavel Kabina is a very notable name on this list of names in this trade. Of course, he was with Tampa Bay for the majority of his career, made his way up to Toronto, and of course, went to Atlanta in that trade, played one season, had a really good season, actually one of his best seasons in the National Hockey League. Went back to Tampa, went to Philly, went back to Tampa, finished his NHL career, at least in Philly, went over to Switzerland, and that was that. So, and then you get to Tim Stapleton. He played a collective 51 games for Atlanta. See, this is a tough one. If you go just Exelby for Kubina 1-for-1, obviously this trade would never happen 1-for-1. But when you look at those two names alone, the Leafs only really got one season out of him, and Atlanta technically got two out of him. I'm going to mark this down as a loss for Toronto because Atlanta did get a bit more use out of Kabina. Not much use, but still they got some more use out of him than they did Exelby and Stewart. Moving forward, 26 days later, Toronto would acquire Wayne Primo and a 2011 second-round pick that eventually became Brandon Saad. Of course, the Leafs would not hold on to that pick. We'll get to that in a second. They acquired that from Calgary in exchange for Anton Strawman, Colin Stewart, and a 2012 seventh-round pick. Of course, Stewart was acquired by the Leafs in that Pavel Kabina trade, and then they shipped him out to Calgary. That's why he never played for the Leafs. Wayne Primo, who is a very notable name from Scarborough, of course, former Owen Sound player and Austria General, had a very good career in the NHL. Of course, he only played one season for the Leafs. He really didn't do anything. He was just kind of a bottom six guy. That was it. Then you look at the other side, Anton Strawman, with the recent news of him possibly not playing in the NHL for the playoffs or even for the foreseeable future, was still a pretty decent defenseman. Now, of course, he never played for Calgary because he was then later on flipped. Of course, he went to Columbus, and then the rest is history. And again, Colin Stewart, Calgary just kept him in the minors and just got flipped between a bunch of different teams. But then, of course, you get to this pick right here. This pick right here, ignore the Wayne Primo part. This pick, of course, would get flipped later on, which we'll get to in a minute. You basically got Primo. You got rid of Stewart. You had to give up a 7th round pick. You get rid of this pick. If Strawman had played for Calgary, I'd consider this a loss for Toronto. I'm going to say this is a draw. I'm going to say this is a draw just because Primo really didn't do anything with Toronto. Of course, the pick would be flipped later, and Strawman never played a single game for Calgary. So I'm going to consider this a draw. It might be a little controversial to be considering it a draw, but really, it'd be a totally different story if Strawman actually played for Calgary. It'd be a totally different story. August 10th of the same year, Toronto would acquire a 2011 conditional pick in the 6th round that became Dennis Robertson in exchange for Dustin Bogey, which would be sent to Anaheim. And yeah, Pogge was one of those promising goaltenders that come through the junior ranks and just never panned out. He really didn't. It just really bad numbers, really, especially with Toronto. In 7 games, a 4.36. Yeah, it's pretty bad considering that Dennis Robertson, not a very notable name. A lot of people do still talk about Pogge. I'm going to consider this a draw. You could call it a win just because Burke actually got rid of Justin Pogge, but this is really a wash trade. This was just to get rid of Pogge and just get something in return. And then, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, we get to the trade where Toronto would get rid of that Brandon Saad pick. Toronto would acquire a 2010 second-round pick, which became Jared Knight, from Chicago in exchange for the 2011 second-round pick that became Brandon Saad and a 2011 third-round pick that became Michael Paliotta. This is a loss for Toronto. There is no debating this. Brandon Saad is still one of the most underrated players in the National Hockey League today. And also the Leafs did end up flipping this pick, which we will get to. As you can see at the top, we'll get to that in just a minute. So Toronto basically got nothing and gave up the pick that became Brandon Saad. This is a loss for Toronto. It's not even up for debate. It can't be up for debate. It's such a one-sided trade. And then, of course, Saad won a cup with Chicago. If he ended up being nothing, then maybe this conversation would be different. But still, Toronto got rid of this pick right here, which, obviously basically means you just gave up Brandon Saad for nothing. So there's that. And then, of course, 13 days down the road, that Jared Knight pick would be flipped as Toronto would acquire Phil Kessel from the Boston Bruins in exchange for the first-round pick that became Tyler Seguin and second-round pick that became Jared Knight in 2010 and a 2011 first-round pick that became Dougie Hamilton. Phil Kessel, of course, he was one of the more love-hate relationship players in Toronto. Of course, he put up great numbers for the Leafs, but the problem was Burke didn't build a team around Phil Kessel, and that was the biggest problem. Phil was considered to be lazy. He was, a guy that never back-checked. People called him fat. They made fun of him. And then, of course, he gets traded to Pittsburgh and wins back-to-back cups, which looks even worse for Toronto. And then, of course, you get to flipping 2 first-round picks which became Tyler Seguin and Dougie Hamilton. And of course, going forward, Boston would win the cup with Tyler Seguin in his rookie season. And for that reason alone, this is a loss for Toronto. Again, this is not up for debate in my eyes. Yes, Phil Kessel was good for the Leafs, but here's the thing. You gave up 2 first-round picks, both of them becoming really notable names in the league, especially Tyler Seguin, who's become a superstar and won the cup in his rookie season. This is a loss, and you can't tell me otherwise. Moving on, December 3rd, Toronto would acquire the rights to Philip Parody in exchange for Yuri Talusti. This is an interesting one because Talusti actually went on to play for a few years with Carolina. I was going to say this was a wash, but no. This is another loss for Toronto because Carolina got use out of Talusti after they flipped him. And I mean, obviously not huge numbers, but he still put up his best career total in one season with Carolina in 2012-13. And, maybe having Talusti might have helped Kessel. I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing, but again, Philip Parody, like that's who you guys got back in exchange for Talusti. No, it's not a huge loss for Toronto, but it's still a loss nonetheless. January 31st of the new year in 2010, Toronto would acquire Jean-Sébastien Giguère from the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for Jason Blake and Vesa Toskala. Jean-Sébastien Giguère played one season for the Leafs, a 287 goals against, about a 500 record. Not great numbers, considering he was on the Leafs team that was kind of struggling at the time. And then, of course, you get to the other side of the table where you flip Jason Blake. Anaheim still got, 2.5 seasons worth of play from him. He was still a decent enough centerman to be able to help out a team. And then, of course, you get to the goaltender, Vesa Toskala, who was not great for Toronto, let's be honest. Never played a single game with Anaheim, by the way. Not surprising because Anaheim would be crazy to actually use him. So, I mean, basically, this is Giguère for Blake. You get one season out of Giguère. Anaheim gets 3 seasons, 2.5 seasons out of Blake. It's a very small loss. It's very small, but it's a loss nonetheless because if you maybe kept Blake, it might have helped with the whole Phil Kessel situation. You did get Giguère back, who, of course, was an amazing goaltender back in his earlier years, but he only played one season for Toronto. So it is another loss. It's a very small loss, but it's a loss nonetheless. And Burke was not done that day. He would then later acquire from Calgary Keith Ollie, Frederick Sjostrom, and Dion Phaneuf in exchange for Nicholas Hagman, Jamal Mayers, Matt Stajan, and Ian White. A 7-player deal. Yeah. Ollie only played 57 games for the Leafs during his time with Toronto. Frederick Sjostrom only played 19 games for the Leafs in 09-10. And then in 10-11, played 66 games, really didn't do anything. And then, of course, you get to the guy who would eventually be named the captain for the Toronto Maple Leafs, Mr. Dion Phaneuf, who spent quite a bit of time with Toronto before eventually he shipped out to Ottawa, and then went to LA, and went back. Like, he's been flipped so many times. It's incredible. And then on the other side, Nick Hagman, he played over 100 games for the Leafs, which I respect, and put up some of his best career point totals with the Leafs. And, trading him to Calgary, he didn't really work out with the Flames, which is kind of a win for Toronto. Jamal Mayers, who the Leafs had, and then, of course, went to Calgary, and then San Jose. Yeah, that kind of cancels it out. Matt Stajan, who kind of became a bit of a staple for Calgary. His time with Toronto was great. I wish they never traded Stajan, but he did some decent time with Calgary. Didn't put up the same numbers, which again, shows that maybe he kind of ran out of gas, which kind of worked in the Leafs' favor. And then, of course, Ian White is the other guy who, again, never panned out. Even though the Leafs, this era of the Leafs, was a very dark time, I should say, there was a lot of, drama in the locker room, with Phaneuf and Kessel having the blame pointed their way. Phaneuf was still a leader for the Leafs at the time. And I'm going to say this is a win for Toronto because they get Phaneuf in this deal. He was still young. He's still developing, but you needed to help out your defense core a little bit. Was Phaneuf the best option available? Probably not, especially considering you trade a pick that would eventually become Dougie Hamilton, which in retrospect is pretty bad. This is a minor win for Toronto just because Phaneuf would become the captain. He'd be that leader in the locker room. As much as fans might have hated Dion, at least he tried. On March 2nd, Toronto would acquire Luka Caputi and Martin Skula from Pittsburgh in exchange for Alexei Podkorowski. Luka Caputi played a whole 19 games for the Toronto Maple Leafs in 09-10, and then 7 more before going down in the minors and finishing the rest of his career overseas. Martin Skula, I forgot his name is glitched out here on NHL Trade Tracker. And then for Alexei Podkorowski, who, of course, was another notable name for Toronto, went to Pittsburgh for one full season for 16 games, and then was bounced around for the rest of his career. I am going to say this is a nothing deal because Caputi didn't last with Toronto, Podkorowski didn't last with Pittsburgh. And, we could look up Martin Skula, but really, this is kind of a nothing deal in my eyes, at least. Yeah. Burke was not done that day. He had 4 trades that he made on March 3rd. Man, he loved to make trades in the month of March. First trade he would make on March 3rd was acquiring Chris Peluso from Pittsburgh in exchange for the 2010 6th-round pick that became Joe Rogalski. This is a nothing deal. Same day, trade number 2, Toronto would acquire Matt Jones, the 2010 4th-round pick that became Philip Grubauer, and a 2010 7th-round pick that would become Kellen Jones from Arizona in exchange for Lee Stempniak. Matt Jones never played a game for Toronto. So there's that. And then, of course, you get to maybe the most notable name in this trade, aside from Lee Stempniak, at least in the current day of the NHL, Philip Grubauer, who, of course, went to Washington afterwards. This pick would be flipped. And, Kellen Jones, that pick would be flipped as well, if I'm not mistaken, for Lee Stempniak. 2 seasons with Phoenix and put up decent numbers. Which season was his best statistical season? St. Louis in 06-07, when he put up 52 points and played the full season. So with Toronto, didn't really amass the same kind of point total. Would be flipped around afterwards. I don't think he's playing anymore. He could very well play one more season, but see, this is a tough one. Toronto basically traded Matt Jones, only got Matt Jones back in this entire deal for basically Lee Stempniak, and of course they get rid of these 2 picks. This is a real tough one in my eyes to call. As great as Stempniak was for the Leafs, he was only there for 2 seasons. So, I don't know. It's really hard because Phoenix/Arizona only really had him for 1 full season. I'm going to say this is a draw. It's, you can call it whatever you want. Really, you could say this is a loss for Toronto or whatever, but really the trades just kind of cancel each other out. I don't know. I'm still thinking about it. No, you know what? I'm going to say that's a loss for Toronto because they lost Stempniak. They would get rid of these 2. Basically, they gave up Lee Stempniak for nothing. So, yeah, this is a loss in my eyes. Moving forward, New Jersey would acquire Martin Skula in exchange for the 2010 5th-round pick that would become Sam Carrick. Let's look up Mr. Martin Skula, shall we? Just to try and get an idea of what kind of player he could have very well been. Spent the majority of his NHL career with Minnesota, with Dallas. Then he went to New Jersey, played 19 games, didn't really pan out very well. And then, of course, you get to the other guy. Oh my God, Elite Prospects is taking a massive dump right now. And then, of course, you get to the other player in this deal, Sam Carrick, who played, 16 games, so 19 games for the Leafs. Yeah, that's I don't know. This is a tough one. He was the pick that Toronto went with. His rights, signed by Anaheim and whatnot. Boy. He's in the minors now, considering he never played for New Jersey. You know what? I didn't mean to go to that. You know what? I'm going to call this a nothing deal because both players never really lasted with the other team and didn't really make much of an impact. Final trade of March 3rd. Toronto acquires a 2011 7th-round pick that became Max Everson in exchange for Joey McDonald. Joey McDonald didn't play a single game for Anaheim. We don't even have to look up the stats of Max Everson because we already know this is a nothing deal. Never really benefit both sides. June 26th, Toronto will acquire a 2011 6th-round pick that became David Brohl in exchange for the 2010 7th-round pick that became Kellen Jones. Of course, Jones was part of that trade. That was part of the trade for Lee Stempniak, and then, of course, the Leafs got rid of him. This is another nothing deal, really. David Brohl and Kellen Jones, not really big names in the NHL. Neither player really made a difference for their teams. So, yeah, this is kind of a nothing deal. June 26th, another trade on this day, another handful of draft picks or of trades. There are some draft picks involved as well. Toronto would acquire the 2010 second-round pick that became Bradley Ross, bit of a reach, in exchange for Jimmy Hayes, who would be sent to Chicago. Looking at how many games he played there, he only played 43 games with the Blackhawks, and then, of course, got bumped around. He could very well play next season. I don't know where, though. And he was Toronto's second-round pick in 2008, I should mention, which is crazy. Bradley Ross, I don't really need to look up his name. Actually, I probably should. Just to be safe. There's probably going to be nothing about this guy anyway. Again, I could be wrong. I could very well be wrong. I've been wrong in the past. Let's take a look at Mr. Brad Ross. He was Toronto's second-round pick of that year. Never played a single game for the Leafs. So that's great. That's fantastic. I'm going to call this a loss for Toronto because Ross never panned out and Hayes actually was used in Chicago. It's a very minor loss for Toronto, but still, at least Chicago got use out of Hayes, especially since Toronto drafted Hayes and never used him. So that's great. And then, of course, we get to the pick where Grubauer would be flipped, at least the pick that became Grubauer. Toronto would acquire a 2010 4th-round pick that became Petter Gronberg and a 5th-round pick in the same year that became Daniel Brodin in exchange for that 4th-round pick that became Philip Grubauer. Again, very minor, minuscule loss for the Leafs. But Grubauer is the biggest name out of this group. And he could have very well been maybe a part of the solution for the Leafs goaltending at the time, at least in the backup position. But they decided not to use Grubauer moving forward because they never drafted him. So it works out for Washington. Unfortunately for the Leafs, it didn't work out for them. Final page. Here we go. And there are a couple more picks that I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about. Toronto would acquire Mike Brown. God, I loved his mustache. From Anaheim in exchange for the 2010 5th-round pick that became Chris Wagner. And this is another one of those nothing deals. Yeah, Brown, he actually got some use with the Leafs. Actually, you know what? No, hang on. It's a very small win, but it's a win for Brian Burke. That's not bad, actually. They got use out of Mike Brown for longer than I thought and originally remember. Good on you, Burke, for getting a decent grinder, and especially a guy with a really good mustache. Final trade of this day, Toronto acquires a third-round pick in 2010 that became Sondre Olden from Los Angeles in exchange for 2012 third-round pick. And this is a nothing deal. Pick is never specified for Los Angeles, and Sondre Olden didn't really pan out. Fast forward 4 days later, a pretty notable trade, honestly, as Toronto would acquire Bill Sweat and Christopher Steek from the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Christopher DiDomenico, Philip Parody, and Victor Stahlberg. Bill Sweat never played a single game for the Leafs. There you see it. Christopher Steek, very notable name on this list. Only played 53 games for the Leafs, and then, of course, went back and forth. Stanley Cup champion as well with Chicago. He would eventually go back to the Blackhawks. Getting to DiDomenico, never played for Chicago, which is a shame because DiDomenico is a pretty decent player in my eyes. Philip Parody never made it to the National Hockey League, which, goes back to the trade I talked about a few minutes ago. And then, of course, you get to Victor Stahlberg, who only played 40 games for the Leafs in 09-10 and just never really panned out. So really, you could say this is Stahlberg for Stieg. This is kind of a nothing deal. It really is. Because both teams really only got maybe a season or two of use out of their players. You know what? No, hang on. I'm doing it again. I'm making the mistake of judging this too early. Stahlberg got used by Chicago for 3 years, and then of course Versteeg went back to Chicago. You know what? No, that's a loss for Toronto because Stahlberg, he got some pretty fair use in Chicago. August 27th, Toronto would acquire Matt Lashoff from Tampa Bay in exchange for Alex Barry and Stefano Gigliotti. Did Stefano. Anyway, Matt Lashoff, 11 games for the Leafs. Oh, boy. Yeah, that didn't really pan out very well. Stefano, never played for Tampa, former Lewiston Maniac. Tougie would love that. And then Alex Barry, who was never used in Tampa. And it is another one of those nothing trades. January 13th, no trades made for the entire first half of the season by Brian Burke until January 13th of the new year, where the Leafs would acquire Fabian Brunstrom from Dallas in exchange for Mikhail Stefanovic. Brunstrom never played a single game for the Leafs, while Stefanovic never played a single game for Dallas. Say it with me now. Meh. This is a mad deal. February 9th, our most notable trade in quite a little while. Toronto would acquire Jake Gardner and Joffrey Lupul along with the 2013 conditional fourth-round pick from Anaheim in exchange for Francois Beauchemin. Jake Gardner is almost similar to Dion Phaneuf, who people complain about his defensive style and considered him to be a terrible hockey player, but was with Toronto for a while before eventually going to Carolina. Joffrey Lupul, even though he was injury-prone, was a fantastic player. 2011-12 alone shows how great he was. This was a great acquisition for the Leafs. And then, of course, you get the Francois Beauchemin, who spent quite some time with Anaheim. A lot of time with Anaheim. Spent time with them beforehand. And then, of course, went to Toronto, went straight back to Anaheim, went to Colorado for 2 seasons, and then finished his career in Anaheim. This is a very, very close call. I mean, Anaheim got a lot of use out of Francois Beauchemin, but just never really, for a defenseman, obviously, he kind of put up numbers and went on that pretty decent playoff run with Anaheim back in 2014-15. If Joffrey Lupul wasn't hurt so many times, this wouldn't even be, questioned. I think Toronto would win this deal. I kind of have to give this one. You know what? I'm going to give this to Burke because Joffrey Lupul turned out to be really good. As much as people dunk on Gardner for him and his defensive skill, he was still with the Leafs for quite a bit of time. And you got two players for the price of one at the time, so I'm going to consider that a win for Mr. Brian Burke. February 14th, Toronto would acquire the first-round pick that became Stuart Percy, and a 2011 third-round pick that became Josh Levo, former Sudbury Wolf Josh Levo, from Philly in exchange for Chris Versteeg. And, of course, Josh Levo, bit of a tough story for him because he was flipped between the minors and the NHL so many times, and now, of course, is over in Vancouver. But then you get to the other side of the table with Versteeg. One season, not even a full season with Philly, and then got bounced around all over the place. I'm going to consider this a win for Mr. Burke because Levo, even though he was bounced around the American Hockey League and National Hockey League time and time again, he was with Toronto for a decent amount of time. While Versteeg was only with Philly for not even a full season, and I just think that that's a nice win. Just for Josh Levo alone, you can get to Stuart Percy. He just never panned out, especially as a first-round pick. That's one of those picks that I was just like, why? Anyway, the next day, Toronto would acquire Aaron Voros from Anaheim in exchange for a 2011 conditional seventh-round pick. That was never exercised because Voros never re-signed with the Leafs. He did not even play a single game for Toronto. It helped their minor system, but this is a nothing deal because never played a single game. And they basically got a minor leaguer for nothing, which honestly isn't that much of a win. And then we get to quite possibly, at least in my opinion, one of the worst trades that was ever made by Brian Burke. And as you'll see here in a second, that's why. Caberlet, if you didn't know, was one of the two Leafs players I idolized growing up as a kid. And the fact that Burke traded him to the enemy at the time was not only heartbreaking, it was enraging. And I could not forgive Burke ever since. So on this day, February 18th of 2011, Toronto would acquire Joe Colborne and the 2011 first-round pick. The 2011 first-round pick that would eventually become Ricard Raquel, and a 2012 conditional second-round pick that would be exercised if the Bruins reached the Stanley Cup Finals, which they did, by the way, in exchange for Thomas Caberlet. Joe Colborne spent some time with the Leafs, which is fine and dandy and whatnot. We'll get to this pick in a second because it's coming up. You can see it at the top of the screen. But Thomas Caberlet was one of the faces of your franchise. And you traded him to Boston, and he won a Stanley Cup with the Bruins. I could mark this down for 5 losses if I wanted to. I could mark it down for 15. I can mark it down from the time since the Leafs last won a cup. A loss for each year since they've won a cup. I'm going to consider it only one loss, though, because I'm not that ridiculous. This broke the hearts of so many people. And then, of course, the debate is there, which Thomas Caberlet do you hate more, the Thomas Caberlet in Montreal or the Thomas Caberlet in Boston? For me, it's Boston because he won a cup with the Bruins. In my opinion, Boston is our biggest rival, at least at this point, because, you go back to previous playoffs against them. The Leafs have never had to run into Montreal, at least since I've been alive, which is saying something. So, in terms of current rivals, it is Boston at number 1. You put Montreal second, and then maybe you put Ottawa or Buffalo third, and traded him to the enemy that would eventually go on to win the Stanley Cup with Tyler Seguin, by the way. You just handed Boston the cup that year. Burke single-handedly handed them the cup that season. Yes, Caberlet was a rental and didn't do much, but you gave Boston the pick that became Tyler Seguin, and you also gave them the pick that became Dougie Hamilton, and you gave them Thomas Caberlet in one fail swoop. Is a massive loss for Toronto, and you cannot convince me otherwise. Personal feelings or not, Burke made a terrible decision to make this trade. And I still don't forgive him for this. I love Caberlet to death, and I will have his jersey till the day I die. You cannot trade Thomas Caberlet. And the fact they got a first-round pick for Caberlet was great. I wouldn't be as mad if this first-round pick actually stuck around. But which you'll find out in a couple minutes, he did not. 10 days later, Toronto would acquire a 2012 7th-round pick from the New York Rangers in exchange for John Mitchell. New York never got much use out of Mitchell, and the pick's not specified. Let's consider that one a draw. June 24th, the Leafs would acquire John Michael Lyles from Colorado in exchange for a 2012 2nd-round pick. John Michael Lyles did spend two seasons and a little bit of change before he was traded to Carolina. Lyles was okay. Again, this pick isn't really specified. Let's go to the draft and see if it does, in fact, come up. I'll be shocked if it does. Could very well be Mitchell Hurd. There's a chance that it could be Mitchell Hurd. I don't think Colorado had another pick in this round. Nope, just Mitchell Hurd. Nah. I'm going to say this is a nothing trade, really. You know, if I got that pick right, then it's still a nothing trade. And then, of course, we get to probably the biggest first-round pick flop that I've ever seen in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Toronto would acquire the 2011 first-round pick that became Tyler Biggs from Anaheim in exchange for the first-round pick that became Rickard Rakell and the second-round pick that became John Gibson. This is probably the most lopsided trade that I have seen so far in this video, and it's not even close. Rickard Rakell is an unbelievable player, and John Gibson is one of the most bright stars in terms of goaltending in the National Hockey League. There is no debate about this, that Toronto absolutely got fleeced in this deal. And that first-round pick that became Tyler Biggs, don't get me started. As decent as he was in junior, he was not a first-round pick. Not even close. And again, you can't convince me otherwise. The next day, the Leafs would acquire a 6th-round pick from Anaheim in exchange for a 6th-round pick that became Josh Manson. What is it with Brian Burke and the Toronto Maple Leafs basically handing Anaheim their future? Why? This, I'm going to stop. That's a loss, without a doubt. They handed Anaheim 3 of their best players at the time. Rickard Rakell and John Gibson are still there. I'm pretty sure Manson's still there. I could be wrong. But 3 players in 2 days that you could have had, but instead you went for a 6th-round pick and Tyler Biggs. Congrats, Burke. You totally screwed the Leafs' future up. We're almost there. We're almost at the end. Toronto would acquire Cody Franz and Matthew Lombardi and a 2013 conditional 4th-round pick from Nashville in exchange for Brett Lebda, Robert Slaney, and a 2013 conditional 4th-round pick. So cancel out these 2 picks because they're basically just they're just the same pick. So Franz and Lombardi for Lebda and Slaney. Cody Franzen, did spend a little bit of time with Toronto and actually didn't do too bad, really, for them. Matt Lombardi, 62 games for the Leafs. Great. Lebda never played for Nashville, which is crazy. Robert Slaney never played for Nashville. This is a win for Burke and the Leafs because they got Franzen and Lombardi. They got time out of them. Lebda and Slaney, they never really played. October 4th, David Steckel would go to Toronto in exchange for a 2012 4th-round pick. Let's go back to the draft. Just to see what this pick could have very well been. Thank you, Hockey DB. So New Jersey, looks like they picked Ben Thompson from Kitchener with that pick. I believe, was it a 4th-round pick? Yes, it was. Okay. So it looks like, unless they flip the pick to move up or down in the draft, they picked Ben Thompson. So, yeah, this is kind of nothing, isn't it? Only really played 2 seasons with the Leafs. It's a draw. January 3rd, Anaheim would reacquire Luca Caputi in exchange for Nicolas Deschamps. Of course, Caputi never played for Anaheim. If Deschamps played for Toronto, this could be a win. No. Okay, so this is another nothing deal. Neither player played for these 2 teams down the road. Tampa would get back Keith Ollie from Toronto in exchange for Carter Ashton. Keith Ollie would play 15 games for Tampa Bay. I believe after they reacquired him. No, excuse me. He played 19 games here and then another 45 here. And then Carter Ashton did play for the Leafs a little bit. You know what? This trade kind of cancels. These 2 players kind of cancel each other out. So this is a nothing deal. February 27th, same day, Toronto acquires Mark Frazier from Anaheim in exchange for Dale Mitchell. What is up with Anaheim and Toronto making these trades? Frazier played 45 games in 12-13, 19 in 13-14, and that was it for his time with the Leafs. And then Dale Mitchell on the other end never played for Anaheim. So you know what? That's another win for Brian Burke. Very small, minute win for him. That's a win nonetheless. We're getting to the end. His second to last trade would be shipping Jonas Gustafsson to Winnipeg in exchange for a 2013 conditional 7th-round pick. And apparently, according to Hockey DB, Gustafsson does not exist. Let's get to the 2013 NHL draft just to check out who the Leafs could have very well gotten. And this is a 7th-round pick. Let's go see where that pick could very well be. Andreas, really? No. That pick became Andreas Johnsson. There's no way. Really? Wow. Okay, so you learn something new every day, apparently. I don't know if this is the actual pick. I really don't. But holy hell. Yeah, let's chalk that up as a win, why don't we? If that pick was indeed the pick that became Andreas Johnsson, holy crap, that is a one-sided trade. Because Gustafsson just never panned out and then went back overseas. You know, as quiet as Johnsson has been since his real breakout season in 2018-19, and his time could very well be over with Toronto, he is still a fantastic player, man. Johnsson for Gustafsson, I would say you're crazy if that were the trade you offered me. That's a win for Toronto. And then the last trade that Burke would make with the Leafs is a very big trade, very big win, I should say. Toronto acquires James Van Riemsdyk from Philadelphia in exchange for Luke Schenn. Luke Schenn was one of those players that was hated across the board in Toronto, and I cannot argue with that. Apparently, I can't check out the player names. But JVR was fantastic during his time with Toronto. He was one of those guys that really helped develop the Leafs into an actual playoff team at the time. And then, of course, you know, when Matthews came along, he helped him as well. I wish he didn't go back to Philadelphia. It still breaks my heart that he did go back to Philly. But Van Riemsdyk's time at Toronto was unforgettable and was one of my favorite players at the time in Toronto. So that is it. That's Brian Burke's trade history. And going through, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 10 wins for Mr. Burke. Going through the losses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 losses. And the draws, there's a lot of draws. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 draws. So it's kind of close, actually. A lot closer than I thought initially at the time. And, of course, you know, Toogie's take on his trade history in Toronto is a little bit different. It's not exactly the same. And, again, our opinions will matter to ourselves. They could change for a lot of other people. The wins and losses column were very close. The draws obviously eludes that and, overshadows it. Brian Burke's time with the Toronto Maple Leafs was a roller coaster, to say the least. Yes, he made some pretty decent trades, JVR probably being one of the best. But then you get to him trading, the picks that became Tyler Seguin, Dougie Hamilton, Rickard Rakell, John Gibson, and, obviously Caberlet is another player that you got rid of. And it's ridiculous to think about it now. But yeah, that was Brian Burke's trade history with Toronto. From the looks of it, he only made 42 trades at the time since he started, and it kind of worked for Toronto, and then it kind of didn't, because they got some starting talent like Phil Kessel at the time, and maybe Dion Phaneuf you could consider as well, and JVR before Burke walked out the door. So, I mean, his time wasn't the greatest, but he still made decent enough trades where he did kind of bring the Leafs back into playoff contention. So, yeah, that's going to do it for this video. It's something a little different. It's something I've been wanting to doing for a while. If you did enjoy it and want to see another video like this down the road, make sure you leave a like. Subscribe if you are new around here, trying to continue to grow the channel a little bit. And, yeah, I don't know which other GM I'm going to do. I might do another Toronto GM down the road. We'll wait and see. If you do want to see another video of a GM's trade history, please do let me know, and I'll try and do my best to try and get that out as soon as possible. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and until I talk to you next time, take care and stay safe. We'll see you later.